They had been trapped for 5 days. Their ammunition was running low, their wounded were suffering, and they had almost no water. Then a group of armed men approached carrying a white flag. They promised the families safe passage. All the travelers had to do was surrender their weapons, place the wounded and the youngest children in wagons, and follow their rescuers out of the valley. So they agreed. And less than an hour later, nearly every adult and older child was dead. When I first read that part, I honestly went back and checked it again. Because this was not a battlefield surrender between two armies. These were families traveling to California. Mothers were carrying babies, children were walking beside their fathers, and the men escorting them to safety already knew what was about to happen. I grew up around historians, so I was taught very early that the most important question is rarely just, what happened? The harder question is, how did ordinary people convince themselves to do it? And Mountain Meadows may be one of the most uncomfortable examples I have ever studied, because the men responsible were not lifelong killers. Most of them were farmers, neighbors, church members, fathers, and local officials. Before that week, many had probably considered themselves decent men. After that week, they returned to their homes and tried to continue living as if an entire wagon train had not been destroyed. That is what makes this story so frightening to me. It is easy to understand violence when we imagine obvious monsters. It is much harder when the people involved look ordinary. To understand how this happened, we have to begin before the wagon train ever reached Mountain Meadows. In 1857, Utah Territory was living under the shadow of war. President James Buchanan had decided to replace Brigham Young as territorial governor and sent roughly 1,500 federal troops west to support the new administration. In Washington, officials believed Utah might be resisting federal authority. In Utah, many Latter-day Saints believed the army was coming to drive them from their homes, or worse. And that fear did not appear from nowhere. Many of these settlers had memories of violent expulsion from Missouri and Illinois. Their founder, Joseph Smith, had been killed by a mob. Families had already crossed half a continent after losing homes, property, and relatives. So when rumors spread that another army was coming, people did not hear, "The government is changing a governor." They heard, "It is happening again." Now, understanding that fear does not excuse what came later, I want to make that absolutely clear. Context explains the road. It does not forgive the destination. But fear changes the way people interpret everything around them. A stranger stops looking like a stranger and starts looking like a spy. A careless insult sounds like a threat. A rumor becomes evidence. And once a community becomes convinced that it is surrounded by enemies, almost any action can be presented as self-defense. Brigham Young declared martial law and instructed settlements to conserve grain and prepare for conflict. Sermons across the territory used intense, sometimes violent language about enemies, betrayal, loyalty, and divine judgment. Again, words do not automatically produce murder. Most people who heard those sermons never harmed anyone. But words create an atmosphere, and atmosphere matters. They tell frightened people what they should notice, whom they should distrust, and which emotions are acceptable. At the same time, a large emigrant company from Arkansas was making its way toward California. History usually calls it the Baker-Fancher Party, after two of its leaders, John Baker and Alexander Fancher. These were not soldiers. They were families with wagons, livestock, children, household goods, and plans for a new life in the West. And from what we know, many of them were relatively successful travelers. They had valuable cattle and experienced leaders. Alexander Fancher had crossed the continent before. This was not a helpless group wandering blindly into the desert, but they entered Utah at possibly the worst moment imaginable. Local settlers had been told to preserve supplies for the coming conflict. The emigrants needed grain and food for themselves and their animals. Some sellers refused them. Arguments followed. Stories began spreading about threats supposedly made by members of the wagon train. Some accounts claimed that emigrants bragged about joining the incoming army. Other rumors connected them to the murder of Parley P. Pratt, a prominent Latter-day Saint leader who had been killed in Arkansas earlier that year. The problem is that rumors do not need to be true to become dangerous. They only need to fit what people are already afraid of. This is something I see even today. Give people a story that confirms their fears, and they often stop asking where it came from. They repeat it because it feels right. Then the next person hears it from 3 different people and assumes it must be verified. Suddenly, nobody knows the original source, but everyone is angry. The emigrants continued south. They eventually reached a place called Mountain Meadows, a broad, grassy valley in southern Utah, where wagon trains commonly stopped to rest their animals before crossing the desert toward California. Just look at the name, Mountain Meadows. It sounds peaceful, safe, almost beautiful. And it was beautiful. That contrast really gets to me. The site of one of the worst mass killings in the history of the American West was not some dark canyon that looked cursed from the beginning. It was open grassland with water, surrounded by mountains. The kind of place where tired families would finally relax. While the emigrants camped, local leaders in Cedar City were deciding what to do about them. One of the central figures was Isaac Haight. He was not only a church leader but also a militia commander and local civic authority. That combination is important. In a small, isolated settlement, the same man could influence your spiritual life, your military obligations, and your standing in the community. Other key figures included militia leaders William Dame, John Higbee, and John D. Lee. Lee is the name most people remember because he was eventually the only participant executed. But treating this as the crime of one man is far too convenient. Lee played a major role, yes, but this operation required planning, communication, weapons, horses, orders, and the participation or silence of many others. According to historical investigations, Haight supported an attack and sent Lee to help organize it. Some local leaders objected when the plan was discussed in council. They argued that the emigrants should be allowed to leave and that Brigham Young should be asked for instructions. A messenger was sent north towards Salt Lake City. That sounds like the moment when disaster should have stopped. People objected. A higher authority was contacted. There was time to step back. But the attack began before the answer returned. Early on September 7th, armed attackers opened fire on the camp. Some local militiamen attempted to conceal their identities and make the assault appear to be solely an indigenous attack. Paiute men had also been recruited, though historians have debated the number involved and the exact extent of their participation. What is not seriously disputed is that local militia leaders planned and directed the final massacre, and that later efforts tried to place the blame entirely on the Paiutes. The emigrants reacted quickly. They pulled their wagons into a defensive formation, dug rifle pits, and fought back. Several people were killed or wounded in the first attack, but the wagon train did not collapse. And I think this surprised the attackers. The emigrants were armed. They had experienced frontiersmen. They could see open ground around the camp. Anyone approaching risked being shot. So, what had probably been imagined as a quick attack turned into a siege. For 5 days, the families remained inside the wagon circle. They had little access to water because the spring was exposed. Their wounded needed treatment. They did not know who was attacking them or why. They sent men out looking for help, not realizing that local officials, the very people they might normally have trusted, were involved. Try to imagine being inside that camp. You have children asking what is happening. You cannot tell them because you do not know. Shots come from the hills. Someone beside you is bleeding. The nearest settlement should contain people who can help, but no help arrives. Every hour makes the situation more confusing. And outside the camp, the attackers now had a different problem. The emigrants had seen white men among the attackers. That meant survivors could identify them. This is the point where the crime changed. The original attack was already unjustifiable, but now the men responsible faced a choice: stop and accept the consequences, or commit a much larger crime to hide the first one. And they chose the second. I had to sit with that for a while, because this pattern appears again and again in history. People do something terrible, then discover that admitting the truth will cost them their reputation, position, freedom, or life. Instead of stopping, they make the next decision based on protecting themselves. The cover-up becomes worse than the original act. At some point during the siege, local leaders approved a plan to kill everyone old enough to describe what had happened. Everyone, not just the armed men, not just the people who might testify in court, women, teenagers, older children. The youngest children would be spared because they were considered too young to provide a reliable account. Read that idea again in your mind. Adults sat together and discussed which children were old enough to remember their parents being murdered. How does a person participate in that conversation and still think of himself as righteous? That question honestly makes me angry. Fear can explain suspicion. Group pressure can explain silence. Military discipline can explain obedience. But at some point, a person still has to look at a child and make a choice. On September 11th, John D. Lee approached the emigrant camp under a white flag. He offered terms. The militia would protect the travelers from the supposed indigenous attackers. The emigrants had to surrender their weapons, but in exchange they would be escorted safely back towards Cedar City. From inside the wagon circle, the offer must have sounded like rescue. They had been under attack for days. Their water was limited. Their wounded were suffering. They had no reason to believe they could remain there indefinitely. A white flag represented negotiation. The presence of local white militiamen seemed to confirm that organized help had finally arrived. They trusted them. The emigrants handed over their weapons. The wounded and the youngest children were placed in wagons. Women and older children walked in one group. The adult men were separated, and each was assigned an armed militia escort. That organization was not accidental. It prevented families from protecting one another. It placed every unarmed man beside someone carrying a gun. It spread the column out along the road. And then, after they had walked away from the protection of their wagons, the signal was given. The militiamen turned on the men beside them and fired at close range. Other attackers rushed toward the women and older children. I am not going to describe the killings in graphic detail. I do not think the victims need to be turned into horror entertainment. The important thing is how completely trust was weaponized against them. The white flag was a lie. The promise of protection was a lie. The escort was a carefully arranged execution. Around 120 people were killed between the first attack and the final massacre. Only 17 young children survived. Think about those children for a moment. One minute they were traveling with parents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and neighbors. Then almost every familiar adult in their world was gone. Some were taken into local households connected to the same communities from which the killers had come. Later, the surviving children were recovered and returned to relatives in Arkansas. I keep wondering what memory looked like for them. Some were very young. Perhaps they remembered only fragments. A wagon shouting, a face leaning over them, a road covered in dust. Others were old enough to carry clearer images. People sometimes say children are resilient, and they are. But I think adults occasionally use that word because the alternative is too painful. Surviving is not the same as being untouched. After the massacre came the cover-up. Property from the wagon train was distributed or sold. Livestock changed hands. The dead were left poorly buried. Participants were told to keep silent. The official explanation blamed local Paiutes. And this part matters because indigenous people were not just recruited into the violence, they were also used as a shield for the reputations of the white men who planned it. For years, versions of the story minimized militia responsibility or presented the event as an uncontrolled indigenous attack. That was convenient. It fit existing prejudice, and it protected local leaders. But a lie repeated for decades does not become history. It becomes a longer lie. The messenger sent to Brigham Young returned after the massacre. He carried instructions telling local leaders not to interfere with the emigrants and to allow them to pass in peace. This point has produced enormous argument ever since. Did Brigham Young order the massacre? The strongest modern historical research has not found evidence that he did. His written response opposed attacking the wagon train, but it arrived too late. At the same time, the climate of fear and hostile rhetoric created by territorial and church leadership helped shape the environment in which local men made their decisions. Both things can be true. A leader may not give a direct order for a crime and still contribute to conditions that make the crime more likely. But contribution is not the same as command, and history becomes useless if we flatten every level of responsibility into one accusation. The people who made the immediate decisions at Mountain Meadows were local leaders. They organized the attack. They continued it. They designed the false truce. They gave the signal. They pulled the triggers. That responsibility belongs to them. For nearly 2 decades, however, almost nobody was punished. Federal investigations began, but the Utah War, local resistance, national political conflict, and eventually the American Civil War made accountability difficult. Witnesses were reluctant. Participants protected one another. Records were incomplete. Stories changed. And here is another uncomfortable truth. When a crime is committed by a network instead of one isolated person, justice becomes much harder. Everyone knows only part of the plan. Everyone can claim someone else gave the order. Everyone can say they were afraid to refuse. Responsibility gets divided into pieces so small that each person convinces himself he barely carries any of it. John D. Lee eventually became the main defendant. He had been a prominent settler and militia officer. He was excommunicated in 1870, arrested, and brought to trial in the 1870s. His first trial ended without a verdict. At the second, prosecutors focused heavily on him. In 1876, he was convicted of first-degree murder. On March 28, 1877, Lee was taken back to Mountain Meadows and executed by firing squad. He was the only participant put to death. And honestly, I have mixed feelings when I read about that ending. Lee was guilty. He helped deceive the emigrants. He participated in the machinery of the massacre. His conviction was not the punishment of an innocent outsider. But was he the only guilty man? Of course not. Making one participant carry the public weight of a collective crime can create the appearance of justice without delivering much of it. Lee himself claimed he had been made a scapegoat. That claim does not erase his guilt, but it raises an obvious question. Why did so many others escape judgment? 9 men were eventually indicted, yet Lee alone was convicted and executed. Men who had helped plan or carry out the massacre lived for years afterward. Some remained respected in their communities. Imagine being a relative of one of the victims and watching that happen. Your family is gone. Their property has been taken. The people responsible live nearby, raise families, attend meetings, and grow old. Then, 20 years later, the government executes one man and expects history to close the file. Would that feel like justice? I do not think it would. But the part of this story that stays with me most is not the trial. It is the decision-making before the massacre. I keep asking, where was the final exit? Was it when settlers first heard rumors about the wagon train? Was it when the attack was proposed? Was it when members of the council objected? Was it after the emigrants defended themselves? Was it during the 5-day siege? Was it when the false truce was discussed? At every stage, somebody could have said no, not necessarily with a dramatic speech. Sometimes history changes because one person refuses to carry a message, lend a horse, guide a group, repeat a rumor, or obey an illegal order. But enough people kept saying yes or stayed silent that the plan continued. That may be the real horror of Mountain Meadows. The massacre did not require every participant to be equally cruel. It required a few determined leaders, a larger group willing to obey, and enough frightened people unwilling to interfere. I work in IT, which is obviously far removed from a 19th century militia, but there is one principle that appears everywhere. Systems fail when everyone assumes someone else is responsible for stopping the failure. A warning appears. One person thinks management knows. Management assumes the engineers handled it. The engineers think security approved it. Then the entire system collapses, and afterward everyone says, "I thought someone else would stop it." Now replace a technical failure with a moral one. "I thought the order came from above. I assumed they knew more than I did. I was only guarding the road. I did not fire until everyone else did. I had a family to protect." Each sentence may contain part of the truth. Together they can become a machine that kills people. And I do not tell this story to condemn every Latter-day Saint, then or now. That would be historically lazy and morally unfair. Many local members had no involvement. Some leaders objected to the attack. The modern church has described the massacre as a terrible and inexcusable departure from Christian teaching. The point is not that one religion produces violence. The point is that any community can become dangerous when fear becomes sacred. Leaders become impossible to question. Outsiders become less than human, and loyalty is measured by obedience. That combination has appeared under different flags, ideologies, religions, and governments throughout history. Mountain Meadows is one example, but the mechanism is painfully universal. A group believes it is threatened. Rumors confirm the threat. Leaders speak in absolute terms. People who hesitate are treated as weak or disloyal. Violence is described as prevention. More blood is presented as the only way to hide it. And the entire time, individuals tell themselves they are protecting their families, their faith, their nation, or their neighbors. This is why I do not find simple stories about evil very useful. If we imagine the perpetrators as creatures completely unlike us, we learn nothing. We walk away feeling safe because we would never be monsters. But what if they were frightened men trying to prove loyalty? What if some disagreed privately but followed publicly? What if they kept waiting for a higher-ranking person to stop the plan? Those possibilities are much more disturbing because they involve weaknesses ordinary people actually have. I would like to believe I would have objected. I would like to believe I would have helped the emigrants. But history has taught me to be careful whenever I imagine myself as the automatic hero. Most people in dangerous systems do not suddenly become brave because the situation becomes serious. They follow the habits they practiced beforehand. If you never question your group in small matters, you probably will not question it when the consequences become enormous. If you always protect your reputation instead of admitting mistakes, you may protect it after a terrible mistake too. If you repeat rumors because they flatter your side, you help build the atmosphere in which someone eventually acts on them. Courage does not begin at the moment someone gives a murderous order. It begins much earlier when saying, "I do not know if that story is true," makes everyone in the room look at you differently. Today, Mountain Meadows contains memorials to the victims. Descendants of the emigrants, descendants of perpetrators, Paiute representatives, local residents, historians, and church leaders have all taken part in efforts to remember what happened there. That matters. Memory cannot restore the dead, but honest memory can prevent a second injustice. The injustice of turning victims into footnotes and lies into tradition. And when I picture the massacre now, I keep returning to the white flag. A white flag is one of humanity's simplest agreements. It says, "For this moment, stop. We will talk instead of kill." It works only because both sides accept that some promises must remain sacred even during conflict. At Mountain Meadows, that symbol was used as a weapon. The emigrants did not die because they refused peace. They died because they believed in it. That is why this story still feels so personal, even after more than a century and a half. Every society depends on invisible agreements, that a doctor will try to save you, that a court will hear evidence, that a rescuer will not become an attacker, that surrender will not be answered with execution. Once those agreements disappear, strength is all that remains. So the question I am left with is not simply, how could they do this? It is something more difficult. What do we do when the people around us begin turning fear into permission? Do we repeat the rumor? Do we wait for someone else to object? Do we follow the group because refusing feels dangerous? Or do we stop the process while there is still time? At Mountain Meadows, there were many moments when someone could have stepped away. Many moments when someone could have warned the families. Many moments when someone could have refused an order. But nearly every exit was passed, and by the time the white flag appeared, the decision had already been made. The travelers thought the danger was finally over. In reality, the men promising to save them had become the danger. And maybe that is the lesson that should stay with us. The worst betrayals in history do not always come from people who openly declare themselves enemies. Sometimes they approach slowly, carrying a symbol of peace, asking you to trust them,